Today we are going to be having our webinar on negotiating a fair commercial lease. Today we are going to be doing our presentation focusing on lease negotiation on the tenant side rather than the landlord side, since most of our client base is small business. So who are, those small businesses frequently have leases that need to be negotiated, and leases are, likely one of the biggest contracts that you will sign for your business all year. So they're important. So we have had this presentation planned for several months now, many months now, and it just so happens that lease negotiation is a very hot topic right now in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have had quite a few clients call with questions about renegotiating or even terminating their lease, or just wondering what are their options as far as renegotiating their lease with their landlord in light of the pandemic. We will touch on that today, as well as just negotiating lease terms more generally. We are recording this presentation. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, and it will be sent to participants after the event. You can submit questions through the Q&A or the chat function, and we might not get to those during our program today, but we will follow up with you after the webinar to answer any questions. Just a quick disclaimer, this presentation is not intended to be legal advice. This is general information, supposed to be educational in nature. So it's not intended to capture all the complexity and nuance of your situation or of the topics that we're discussing today. And so you should certainly talk to an attorney about your specific circumstances before taking any action. Okay, so first our agenda. We're going to be starting today by talking through some principles of lease negotiation, and then we're going to follow up by talking through just laying the foundation of what are commercial lease structures, how do we structure these deals as far as the financial terms, and then we're going to get into some key lease provisions. We're going to talk through some details there, some recommendations, things that tenants should be looking for when negotiating certain provisions, and then finally we are going to touch on COVID-19 and how that is impacting lease conversations today. Okay, getting started. So we're going to start here with key principles of lease negotiation. And the first thing that I want to start with here is this sort of underlying principle that good fences make good neighbors. This is a phrase that I learned just shortly after graduating law school, and it really kind of stuck with me. And it's true of really all contracts. By taking that time to make sure that your contracts really reflect the relationship and that the details of the relationship are thought through, you're going to ultimately have a much more successful relationship in the long term. And given that leases are frequently long-term contracts, we want to make sure that we get it right. So it's easy to want to hand your lease over to your attorney and say, here, negotiate this. I want to sign on Friday. But for many reasons, that's not a good idea. You know your business best, and this is likely one of the largest, most significant contracts that you'll sign. So it is to your benefit to participate in the process, dig into the details, and really figure out what provisions are going to impact your business and your operations, and just make sure that you're going to start your relationship off with your landlord on a good foot. Okay, so the first key principle here is that every business and every lease is unique. I will say that this is very true. There is no such thing as a standard or a boilerplate lease. We want to make sure that our leases are tailored to our business and that it really is serving us as the tenant when we're negotiating those terms. So we shouldn't just take the landlord's first draft and sign it. We should make sure that we are carefully reading it through and being thoughtful about each of the provisions. We also need to consider industry-specific and business-specific needs. For instance, if you're a retail business or you're a customer-facing business, then it's possible that there's another key tenant somewhere in a mall or shopping center that would impact your business if they left. And if that's the case, then you might want a co-tenancy clause. If you are a restaurant or an accounting firm or something of that nature, and a competitor moved in next door, how would that impact your business? So in that case, you might want to consider exclusivity. You might be a business that's sensitive to security. So for instance, a medical lab or a jewelry store, or a business with data storage and servers on site. And if that's the case, then you're going to want to consider your landlord's access rights. So there are just different ways that our specific industry and our specific business needs are going to inform the provisions that we negotiate with our landlord. Moving on to the next slide here. So the next step here is to enlist help, but stay engaged because you know your business best. So of course, you're gonna be more successful if you have a good broker and a good attorney on your side who really understand the leverage points and the market conditions. So when you do find a good broker, they'll be able to work with you on understanding those points and understanding where you do have some levers to pull as far as getting those incentives when you first sign on with a new landlord into a new space. And really getting you the best deal. So enlist a good team. Don't underestimate that expertise. A lease is something that I would not advise that you go in on your own. So having a strong team is really going to serve you well. And then don't ignore the fine print. So, we want to dig into the details as much as it's not the most fun thing to do. We do want to dig into the finer details of the lease. Very small changes can result in a big impact, positively or negatively for the tenant or the landlord. So just as an example, 3 letters can make a difference. So when we're negotiating a cap on common area maintenance charges, then whether that increase is cumulative or non-cumulative, it's only 3 letters, but it really can make a difference in thousands of dollars in operating expenses. So that's just one example where we want to really dig into those details and make sure that we understand how they impact us. Okay, give yourself the best chance at getting what you want, and that is a lease that works for your business and also for you as the business owner. So it's not all about rent. So there are a lot of other non-monetary and monetary incentives and terms that we're going to want to pay attention to. So for instance, the base rent is important, but maybe you also want to get abatement for the first few months of your lease. Maybe you also want some amount for tenant improvements because you do need to build out your space before moving in. Maybe parking is really important for your employees or your customers. Signage, maybe signage is a really important point for you and the building's rules are going to make that difficult. You might want to have lease renewal options. Maybe moving is really difficult for you, or maybe this is a really great location, so you do want to have the option to renew your lease. And then, default late charges, notice periods. Those are all areas where you're going to care about. I've got a question here. So I do have a question. I will try to address questions as we go through here and as they come up. And thank you, Mark, for your question here of, do you have any idea how often personal guarantees are required in a lease? For small businesses, they are frequently required, and we will be touching on that a little bit later in the presentation a little bit more. But particularly with personal guarantees for small businesses, they are frequently required by landlords, purely because of the risk associated. But there are certain things that we can do to negotiate those personal guarantees down so that they have certain limitations built in, or that they only apply for a certain period of time. Okay, and then of course, so time. So this is a really important piece here, is short timelines often make for bad leases. We want to make sure that we give ourselves plenty of time, whether we are negotiating our lease for the first time and we haven't moved in yet, or if we are renewing our lease. We want to make sure that we give ourselves as much time, because as the tenant, you are going to have the most leverage when you have the luxury of time. And then of course, don't dismiss those relationship dynamics. So I frequently am in those lease negotiations with landlords who are unwilling to negotiate, or who are unreasonable, or the first draft of the lease that we get is so one-sided, or is missing some really critical provisions that really every tenant should be looking for. Like for instance, a landlord who doesn't want to include ADA compliance as a representation for the tenant, then that's something that I would be aware of and really take those relationship dynamics to heart, because the way that we start out this relationship during the lease negotiation will often reflect what the rest of the relationship will look like. So we don't want to dismiss that at the beginning. We do want to take that as an indicator to make sure that we know what we're getting ourselves into. Okay, so we're going to get into now the structures of commercial leases. Now, commercial leases are, they're interesting beasts, and they can take a whole bunch of different forms. And even, in the different categories that I'm going to kind of lay out today, there are going to be a lot of modifications and variations within these. So I tend to think of commercial lease structures as a spectrum. So, we go from a full service gross lease to an absolute net lease, but most leases are going to fall somewhere in between those. So I'm just going to go with the extremes first. So a full service gross lease is a lease where the base rent is inclusive of all operating expenses. So you're paying one monthly price and that's all. So that monthly price is typically going to be a lot higher because the landlord is now bearing all of the risk. So if the operating expenses are going to exceed what you're paying, then the landlord bears that risk. Now, of course, if that number is higher and the operating expenses are low, then the landlord reaps all the reward of that as well. So the rent is typically going to be a lot higher in a full service or a gross lease. On the other side, we have an absolute net lease. Now these are where really the exact opposite, where the tenant pays sort of a base rent or a minimum rent as well as all operating expenses. And in the most extreme situation, then the absolute net will mean that the tenant is paying not only for just sort of standard operating expenses, but also for capital expenses. They rebuilding the premises in the event of a casualty, so all of those larger capital expenditures like repaving the parking lot, replacing the roof, rebuilding the structure of the building. So those sorts of really larger costs, those are going to be all included in an absolute net lease. And so when you have that type of a lease, then your base rent will probably be smaller, but you as the tenant are going to be bearing all of the risk associated with the leased premises. An absolute net is most appropriate for a solo tenant occupying an entire building or in a sale leaseback arrangement. So those we don't see, the true absolute net very often. Typically what we see is something in between those, which is going to be a net lease or a modified gross lease. And that is where the tenant pays a base rent plus one or more of the three nets. And the three nets are property tax, insurance, and maintenance, common area maintenance, CAM. And so those, you really want to make sure you read your lease carefully to understand, as the tenant, what is it that I'm responsible for paying for? So, most often we're going to see a triple net, which means that you are responsible for property tax, insurance, and common area maintenance. And so we want to make sure that we understand what each of those things means and what it entails, particularly common area maintenance being a highly variable number and definition. There are a couple of different ways that we can modify these lease types. So for instance, we might have a base year lease, and that means that your operating expenses are calculated based on a base year. So typically your first year that you move into the space is going to be your base year. You're going to pay your base rent only, and operating expenses are included in that first year's base rent. But then every year after that, you pay for the operating expenses as they exceed that base year of operating expenses. So for instance, if your base year operating expenses were $5 per rentable square foot and the next year they're $6, then you're going to pay that extra dollar per rentable square foot in operating expenses on top of your base rent. Percentage rent means that the tenant is typically paying a minimum rent plus some percentage of revenue, typically gross revenue. So this is most appropriate, it's the most common you'll see in shopping malls, shopping centers. And so those are obviously, you're going to be paying a varying rent amount. So we want to be really careful about the definitions in those situations of, what constitutes gross revenue, what are our percentages, and making sure that we really understand how that's calculated, and making sure that we also understand what audit rights exist as well. Okay, so we're going to get into now some of the key lease provisions. Now, of course, I'm not going to be able to address every single lease provision today, but I will do my best to, tackle a significant number of them. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to put those through the chat, and we'll address those as time permits or after the webinar. Okay, so first we're going to get started with financial terms. So this is a list of just, again, not exhaustive, but just some terms that you'll see relating to the financial structure of the lease. So of course, we're going to be talking about rent, prepaid rent, security deposits, tenant improvement allowances, which are the money that your landlord gives to you at the start of your lease to do a build out or on renewal to make improvements to your space. Operating expenses, which we've talked about a little bit, but we'll get into those a lot more because they are one of the heaviest, I would say, in terms of negotiation. And then we talked a little bit about base year and common area maintenance, audit rights, and then we'll get into payment, late fees, interest, and personal guarantees. So the first thing here is rent. How much and when do you pay? Now, we want to understand what is our lease structure and let that inform our conversation here about rent. So typically rent is going to be based on a rentable square footage. And so we want to make sure we understand first, how is that determined? Rentable square footage is not just the space in your office space. So, if you have just, for instance, a commercial office, then your commercial office is going to be your usable square feet, where your rentable square feet is actually going to be what you have in your office plus some percentage of the common area. So we want to make sure that we understand how that's being calculated. Typically, it's done by calculating based on a load factor, which is the sort of full property square footage. That is the rentable square footage of the property divided by the usable square footage. So you'll have some sort of a load factor there based on how much of this of the whole property that your space takes. So we want to make sure we understand how that is calculated, because our rentable square footage is usually going to be how we calculate our base rent as well as our operating expenses. And so, a miscalculation there can really have a large impact. Rent also is not just our base rent. So let's say that our base rent is $1,000 a month. That's not going to be what we only consider rent. Base rent is just a piece of it. The rest of it is going to be what we call additional rent, which is sort of a catch-all bucket for all of the other amounts that the tenant is responsible for paying under the lease. So that's going to include operating expenses, insurance, and taxes, as well as any late fees, interest, anything like that. So all of those things are going to be considered in additional rent. And that will play into sort of when the tenant is in default, is if you've not paid not only your base rent, but really all other amounts that are due under the lease. So late fees and interest, we want to make sure when we're negotiating our lease that we have some sort of a grace period. Most of the time, your landlord's not going to hand you a lease that's going to be beneficial to you in any way, and so you're going to need to negotiate in all of these things, including your rent is going to be due typically on the first of the month in advance every month. And things happen, life happens. So there could be a check gets lost in the mail or something like that. An issue with the direct deposit, and so we want to make sure that we account for those things. So we want to make sure that we have some sort of a grace period. At least 3 days, I would say. Try for 10 if possible. So make sure that you do negotiate in that grace period so that your late fees and interest don't just automatically trigger, on the second of the month. Advertising fund. So again, if you're in some type of a shopping center, you might have some sort of an advertising fund. Again, usually going to be dollars per square foot based on your rentable square footage. So, something, if it's $2 per rentable square foot and you have 1,000 square feet, that's going to be a significant expense. We want to make sure we understand what that is. If you are a franchise, you want to double check to see if that advertising fund can be credited towards your advertising obligations. Percentage rent. So again, here, this is most appropriate in a shopping center. It's going to be calculated based on your gross revenue typically. So we want to make sure we understand what is the definition of gross revenue, because your landlord will probably want some type of audit, right? So we want to make sure that we really understand how percentage rent is being calculated and on what time frame. So whether that's quarterly or monthly, make sure we really understand how that impacts our rent. And then finally, personal guarantees. So as I mentioned before, personal guarantees are frequently required for small business owners. We can negotiate limitations on personal guarantees. Just a few examples here is, if it's a long-term lease, let's say it's a 5-year lease or a 7-year lease or a 10-year lease, then maybe we can negotiate that the personal guarantee goes away after the first 1, 2, or 3 years, once you as a tenant have established a record of paying your rent on time. And so of course, assuming that you've not been in default during that time. You can also limit the amount that is guaranteed under the lease. So for instance, maybe you can attempt to remove common area maintenance or just have a personal guarantee for tenant improvement amounts. So there are just certain things that we can do there. You can possibly negotiate to include a bigger security deposit rather than a personal guarantee. So if cash, is not so much of an issue, but credit is, then that might be a solution there. And then, of course, if you do default and the personal guarantee is at risk of the landlord coming after you personally to satisfy those amounts, then we want to make sure that the landlord is required to mitigate in the event of a default. So let's say, for instance, that you can't pay your rent, that the landlord is required to make a good faith effort to relet the space, and then you'd be only liable for the difference if they're not able to relet it for your full rent amount. Operating expenses. Okay, operating expenses are a really big category as far as negotiation because they take up a lot of space in the lease, I'll say. It's not uncommon to see operating expense provisions that take up multiple pages. So we want to make sure that we, do kind of dig into the details and don't get intimidated by that. So how are they calculated? Now, typically, operating expenses is going to be calculated. You're gonna have an estimate of operating expenses. So let's just say, for example, your landlord estimates that your operating expenses are going to be $5 per rentable square foot, and that's going to be what you pay based off of throughout the term of your lease. Each year, your landlord will give you a report of what the actual operating expenses were, and you'll true up. So one thing to pay attention to is, when is that report due? So I've seen, as quickly as, 60 days from the end of the calendar year, or as long as 180 days from the end of the calendar year. So for your own books, you're going to want to make sure that you know when to expect that from your landlord. And then you're going to have to true up. So whether you have overpaid or underpaid, then you're going to have to true up that amount, assuming that it's not exactly what the landlord had estimated the previous year when you signed your lease. Again, we've talked a little bit about what a base year is. So this is, you have your first year typically of your lease is your base year, and then you pay operating expenses on top of what has exceeded the base year operating expenses going forward. So what year is your base year? That's going to be something that might be a point of negotiation. So for instance, if you move into your space in November and you know that your base year, that your landlord's operating expenses were low that year, then you might want to try to negotiate to have your base year be the following year, the first full year that you've really been in the space. So that's something that you can do. And so we want to make sure that we get as good of terms on the base year, really as high operating expenses, and that base year is going to serve us better because it's going to mean that the following year is less likely to exceed that amount. CAM caps are difficult to negotiate in because landlords don't want them, of course. And so we want to be careful with CAM caps, and it's really going to be a question of incentive. With CAM caps, we're saying, we have this list of common area maintenance, this list of different types of expenses that the landlord can include in your operating expenses that they pass through to you. Now, a lot of tenants are going to want to negotiate in a cap on how much they can be charged for common area maintenance each year over and above the previous year. So for instance, we a lot of times will negotiate in a cap that says you can't charge me more than, between 3 and 6% of what you charged in the previous year. This is great because it does incentivize the landlord to keep common area maintenance consistent and low. Now, of course, we don't want to disincentivize the landlord from upkeeping the building. We want to still maintain quality building, and we want to maintain security. We want to maintain cleanliness. So we don't want to disincentivize in that sense. So we want to make sure that it's balanced and considered there. There are a few different things to consider when negotiating in a CAM cap. And again, I mentioned just a few letters can make a difference. So for instance, cumulative versus non-cumulative. Let's say, for example, that we've negotiated in a CAM cap of 5%. So the landlord can only charge 5% over what they charged in the previous year. Well, is that 5% cumulative or is it non-cumulative? So let's say this year, they only increased the operating expenses by 2.5%. So when next year rolls around, can they increase by only 5%, or can they then piggyback off of the extra 2.5% that they left on the table the previous year? So that's where a large difference can occur. So can you have a 2.5-year increase one year and then a 7-year increase the next year? So that's going to be cumulative versus non-cumulative. CAM caps should also exclude certain non-controllable operating expenses like insurance and taxes and utilities. Those things are things that the landlord doesn't have control over, and so we shouldn't cap those, because obviously if taxes go up, then your landlord is going to be sort of holding the bag for that, and so it's unlikely that they would include those. So those are normal to be excluded. Audit rights. So we do want to make sure as tenants that we do build in some audit rights. If we have any suspicion that operating expenses are not being calculated correctly, or if we get a really, really high bill for operating expenses one year that has been really atypical, then we want to make sure that we have the ability to really dig into the books and records and understand, sorry about that, and really understand make sure that we understand how they've been calculated and that they have been done correctly. Usually an audit clause will also say that if the actual operating expenses were more than 3% or 5% over what was charged, then the landlord will bear the cost of the audit as well. A gross up clause. Now, tenants often prickle at gross up clauses. When you first read them, on first blush, they look to be somewhat unfair. So what is a gross up clause? A gross up clause allows the landlord to, quote, gross up certain expenses as if the building were fully occupied, even if it's not. So let's say, for instance, especially right now during COVID-19 times, it's possible that a lot of folks are terminating their leases and moving out and closing down. So let's say that you have a building that is 50% unoccupied. A gross up clause would allow the landlord to then true up its operating expenses for certain expenses and treat it as if the building were fully occupied. So while instead of paying 10% of a janitorial cost for the whole building, then you would only be paying a very, very small amount if the building was unoccupied. So what it allows them to do is say, okay, janitorial costs are going to go down because my building is significantly unoccupied. So you're going to pay 10% of the folks who are in the building still. So that should only apply to variable operating expenses and not to non-variable operating expenses. So for instance, insurance is not going to change no matter what the building's occupancy looks like. So the cost for insurance should stay the same. Now, one of the most important things that we want to pay attention to when negotiating our operating expenses is what is included in common area maintenance. It's really going to depend on the type of building that you're in and the different sort of aspects of that building. So for instance, if you have a property management company, they might include those management fees, building maintenance and repairs. And so that, that could be structural, windows, all of those sorts of things. Utilities are of course going to be in there. Administrative fees, there's usually going to be a whole bunch of catch-alls here that's going to give the landlord some pretty wide latitude to include anything and everything in common area maintenance. Employee payroll, I've seen even employee uniforms, things like that. Lighting, parking lot maintenance. So again, this is where the specific situation for the building is going to come into play. So if there is a large parking lot, if there's a parking garage, if there's sidewalks, driveways, all of those sorts of things are going to play into the calculation as well. If there's common area restrooms, then those would be a cost for the landlord to maintain as well. I did get a question here. Define what is a capital expense and how those are handled can be a problem sometimes. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really great question. So capital expenses are larger expenses that, you know, would typically be in the landlord's books, would be sort of spread out, amortized over a period of years. So it's going to be really big expenses like replacing the roof. You know, it's something that you do once every 20 years or less. And so we want to make sure that, you know, how are those capital expenses included in operating expenses? And if so, how are those amortized throughout the year and distributed amongst the tenants? Another really big one is parking lot. And so what we can see here, especially, let's say, for instance, you have a base year lease, is if those capital expenses are included in your common area maintenance fees and you have a base year lease and that base year, you know, it's sort of run-of-the-mill year, nothing out of the ordinary, and then the next year the landlord replaces the roof and repaves the parking lot, then your common area maintenance fees can go up significantly the next year, and you know, you might not expect that, so you could end up with thousands of dollars in operating expenses that you didn't expect. So that can be a challenge. So we do want to make sure that we understand the landlord's specific situation, and you can even inquire, you know, when was the last time you repaved the parking lot? When was the last time you replaced the roof? Can I see what your operating expenses have looked like for the last 3 years? And so if you have a good broker on your side, especially, they're going to be able to ask for those things and really understand the landlord's history as far as operating expenses. I hope that answers your question. Okay, so next, getting into occupancy terms. So I've kind of broken these out into different categories, and you know, of course, leases are not that simple, not that cut and dry. So some of these different terms might, you know, of course, will relate to some of the other terms that we've discussed. So of course, your rent is gonna relate to your duration and your term of your lease and things like that. So just to make a clarification. Okay, so getting into our occupancy terms. The first thing we're going to talk about here is term, termination, and options to renew. So how long are you in the space? Longer leases, of course, can typically negotiate more favorable terms. And there are some things that we can do. You know, signing a really long, a 10-year lease, for instance, is going to be really intimidating. So we're going to want to be careful about negotiating in certain things to make sure that we're not stuck in the event that, you know, business has a downturn or the economy has a downturn like we're seeing now. So first, when is the commencement date? This seems like it's something super simple. You know, it's the date you move in, it's the date that you start paying rent. But it really is something that we should consider and be thoughtful about. So for instance, what does it look like for the landlord to deliver the premises? Does the premises need to be in a particular type of condition when you move in? Is there somebody else moving out, and do they need to restore the premises before they can turn it over to you? And what does it mean for you to have accepted the space? So you move in, and let's say that you've you know, noticed a lot of damage, and so, you know, what rights do you have to have the landlord you know, modify and improve the space and make repairs when you do move in? So maybe you have a punch list of items that the landlord is required to modify, you know, and fix within, let's say, 30 days or 60 days from your move-in date. So we want to make sure that we have the premises in the condition that we want it when we move in. Now, to that point, a lot of tenants are going to need leasehold improvements before you move in. You're going to need to do a build out so that your employees are ready to, you know, to get to work as soon as you move in. So who's paying for those leasehold improvements? Oftentimes, when you're negotiating a new lease, your landlord will provide some sort of an incentive of a tenant improvement fund, you know, which you might or might not have to pay some or all of over a period of time back, but those leasehold improvements can be really valuable. And it also proves to be a point for negotiation later on, because landlords do know that they need to provide those leasehold improvement funds. Then it's going to be expensive for them to find a new tenant, so they're going to want to keep you as much as possible once leasehold improvements have been done, because it's customized to your space. So leasehold improvements can be difficult and complicated. If you do leasehold improvements, then you're going to want to make sure to have a detailed work letter describing what type of the work is being done, what approval rights does the landlord have to the work that's going to be done, and what happens if you move in and again things need to be repaired. So and who's responsible for managing those leasehold improvements and those repairs. If it's the landlord, then you're going to want to make sure that you have a drop dead date where if it's not done before a certain date, that you have the ability to terminate, or an additional rent abatement or something to compensate you for not being able to move in on time. So termination. Tenants typically do not have a right to terminate absent landlord default, and oftentimes leases won't even mention landlord default. So you don't have the option to terminate most times, and that's what we're seeing right now with COVID-19 is a lot of folks are coming to us and saying, we would really like to terminate our lease because we have no revenue. And so, unfortunately with these commercial leases, tenants don't typically get to negotiate in a right to terminate. What I have seen is termination milestones. Just as a for instance, if you're moving into a mall and you're not 100% sure if that location is going to be a lot of foot traffic for you, then you might want to negotiate in a termination milestone. For instance, if you're on a percentage rent and your gross revenue does not exceed a certain number, by 2 years into the lease, just as a for example. Alternatively, if you're just on a regular base year triple net lease, then possibly you can just say, year 2, we have the option to terminate on, 12 months notice to the landlord or 9 months notice to the landlord to give them opportunity to find a new tenant. So that is something that a landlord might be open to, especially if you're going to sign a longer term lease. Lease assignment and subletting. So this is sort of, if you don't have the ability to terminate your lease, do you have the ability to assign or sublet it to a new tenant if you can find a new tenant in this climate, of course. So when we do negotiate a lease assignment or a sublet, there are a few things you're going to want to ask for or look for. First, a lot of times what it's going to say when you first get it handed to you is that the landlord can withhold consent for any reason in the landlord's sole discretion, and that's not really fair, especially if it's just a standard office space, in a mall where they have sort of a different classifications of tenants and stores, and that might be something that the landlord would have a right to say no to a new tenant. But in an office space, probably doesn't really make too much of a difference to them as long as the new tenant is solvent and can pay the rent. So we should say that the consent is not to be unreasonably withheld, delayed, or conditioned, and typically the tenant is still going to be required to be liable, especially in the situation of a sublet, but also in a lease assignment, the original tenant is going to still be liable in the event the new tenant defaults. So we want to make sure we have a good relationship with that new tenant as well. I mentioned anchor tenants. So again, if you're in a shopping center, there might be an anchor tenant that really brings a lot of foot traffic into the space. So you might want to negotiate a co-tenancy clause, which gives you the right to reduce your rent or even terminate the lease in the event that anchor tenant delays opening or closes their doors. Restoration. This is something that gets overlooked all the time, is what is it going to look like to move out of the space? Now you've done all these tenant improvements, you've built out the space just right for your business, and now you're going to leave. What does that look like? It can be very expensive to do that restoration if let's say for instance that your lease, which it often does, says that you have to restore the property to the premises to its original state before you leave. So that can be very expensive. I've seen tenants who have put in, for instance, new HVAC systems and had to spend tens of thousands of dollars to have them removed when they had to leave the space. So we want to make sure that we get it in writing with our landlord before putting in a tenant improvement, and making sure that we know whether we're going to be able to take it with us if we want to, or leave it if we don't. Holding over. Holdover occurs when you have stayed past your termination date or your expiration of your lease. Now, this most often occurs when you're negotiating a renewal or an extension and you're not able to get a signed renewal before the expiration date. So again, time is a really big factor here. We want to make sure that the lack of time giving isn't going to cost us money, right? So typically what you're going to see is a 200% holdover rate. So 200% of your base rent is your holdover rate. You can absolutely negotiate that down to 150% or less. I would say that most landlords will agree to 150% from my experience. So we do want to make sure that we know what our holdover rate is, and also we give ourselves plenty of time in negotiating any renewal so that we're not holding over. And also, if we're looking to leave the space, that we give ourselves plenty of time to negotiate a new lease and find a new space in order to move in time. Options to renew and extend. So again, we really like our space. We don't want to leave. We want to make sure that we have that option to renew or the option to extend our lease. So what does that look like? Typically, it's going to include a notice period, a notice requirement, which is going to be somewhere, between 6 and 12 months. It might be, you have to notify us that you want to exercise your option to renew no sooner than 12 months and no later than 9 months before your renewal period. So you've got a narrow window there that you do have to remember to exercise that option. How is rent determined once you have exercised your option to renew? Oftentimes you're going to see fair market value, but what does that mean? So we want to make sure that we have a clear definition of fair market value. A lot of times the landlord's going to want to include a rent floor so that your rent in your renewal term is no less than what you're currently paying under your current lease, or the most recent year of your current lease. So what if the fair market value is significantly less when you go to renew? So if possible, get rid of that rent floor. Again, your broker can help with those negotiations. Appraisal and resolution. What happens if we can't agree on what fair market value is? We know that fair market value, for instance, is defined as, what the average rentable square foot that an average tenant would pay in the market area for a lease of the same duration and a comparable space. But what if we can't agree on what that number is? What if I think it's 5,000 and you think it's 10,000? So how do we come to a resolution there? Oftentimes, again, these are lengthy clauses. It's a full page of providing some type of an appraisal process. And while that can feel cumbersome, once we go to renew, we're going to really appreciate having the ability to go in and put, send an appraiser in there and say, here's what the actual fair market value is. A lot of times those appraisals will look like the landlord appoints an appraiser and the tenant appoints an appraiser, and then they come to an agreement, or they appoint a third appraiser to make that decision. So what happens if the parties can't agree, or even if the appraisers can't agree? This can go one of two ways. So either the option terminates if you can't come to an agreement, and then you have to find a new space. So again, we want to make sure that we give ourselves plenty of time in that case if we do need to find a new space. The other option here is that the appraisers decide. So whether that's a third neutral appraiser that they've appointed, or we use an average of the two or the smaller of the two, we want to make sure we understand what happens if they can't agree. Okay. So rights of first refusal. There are two different types of rights of first refusal that you might see in your lease. The first one is an option to lease space that is, in the same building or, next to your premises. So that might be there. We want to make sure that we, if we want that space, that we understand what triggers the option and how we exercise that. And then also, typically the rent is going to be the same as what you're paying per rentable square foot in your current space. You might also see an option to purchase if the landlord receives an offer from a third party. Again, what does that look like? The landlord's going to want to be really, really careful because it's going to hurt marketability. They're not going to be able to market the space if for sale if they do have to offer you the right of first refusal. So what does that look like? And if they get an offer from a third party, for instance, and it's an all cash offer, does that mean that you're not going to be able to finance the purchase in the event that you get that right of first refusal? So those are just some different options that you might have and rights of first refusal under the lease. You're going to want to make sure that you have an attorney review those carefully because they can be complex. Relocation. I've seen a number of leases where, and this might take some tenants by surprise, that the landlord says that they have the right to relocate you at any time and in their discretion. Those clauses can be somewhat, they can take you aback, especially if you've carefully selected your space. So we want to make sure ideally we just get rid of it. Ideally we say, no can do, we don't want to relocate because that's going to really disrupt the business. It's going to disrupt our employees. I'm going to have to make sure that my clients know where to find us. So that can be really, really disruptive. But in the event that we can't get rid of it, then we want to make sure that we put restrictions on it. So, where can we be relocated to? What does it mean to have a comparable space? Does it mean that it's comparable in size? Does it mean that it's comparable in traffic? All of those sorts of things. And then the landlord, of course, should pay all of the costs associated with that relocation, including marketing costs as well, because you're going to have to notify your clients of that change in space. Improvements and restoration. So tenant improvements, we talked a little bit about this already, but when does your term begin? If you're doing tenant improvements, when do you start paying rent? Are you paying rent for the entire time that improvements are happening? Or are you paying rent once you move in? Or is there a specific date where you're paying rent and those tenant improvements might run through that date? And who's managing those improvements? We want to make sure that we really consider, not having a space. We want to avoid having a space that is under construction that we're paying rent on, of course, if at all possible. Sign a detailed work letter. I already kind of hit on some of these things. If the landlord is managing those tenant improvements, we want to have a drop dead date for when they do need to turn the space over to us substantially completed. And what does substantial completion mean? Again, what are you required to do when you move out? I've already touched on some of these things. Don't underestimate the costs of restoring the premises when you move out. And if you are making improvements to the space, get it in writing whether you do need to make that restoration or not. Alterations, maintenance, and repair. Access rights, property rules and regulations, minimum hours of operations. These are all operational terms. So again, we're thinking through how does our specific business operate in this space, and how does that affect the different lease provisions? So typically for alterations, the landlord is going to give you a lease that says that you can't make alterations to the premises without their consent. Now, that's going to feel kind of silly if, for instance, you want to make a minor repair or a minor change that's non-structural. It only costs a couple $100s, for instance. So typically what we'll do is we'll carve out a minimum dollar threshold before you do need to obtain consent from the landlord to perform non-structural work. So whether that number is $5,000 or $10,000, we want to make sure that we have some leeway, that we don't have to go to the landlord every time we need to fix something. Trade fixtures, again, take it or leave it. So when you make an improvement or you add something to the space, is that a fixture that stays there, or is it something that you get to take with you? And also, what are you responsible for maintaining and repairing in the space? So, oftentimes, windows, for instance, is something that could go one way or the other. Typically, the landlord is responsible for all structural work, but, who's responsible for the plumbing? Who's responsible for the electrical? So we want to make sure that we've thought through, what are we responsible for maintaining and repairing versus what the landlord is responsible for. Access rights. So, this might be something that's no big deal. The landlord comes into your space once in a while to, change out the battery on the fire detector. But it might be a really big deal. If your business is sensitive in any way, we've negotiated leases for, medical labs, for instance, where they've got clean rooms. And so a landlord coming into the space is going to be very disruptive, and possibly, just not possible in certain areas of that space. So we want to make sure that we know that the landlord, has to provide reasonable notice before coming into the space, of course, that they can only come in during normal business hours and that they not disrupt your business. We want to make sure we understand what purposes the landlord can access your space for. Commonly you're going to see inspection, repairs, to show lenders the space, or to bring in, new potential tenants. New potential tenants really shouldn't be able to be a permissible purpose until the last, 6 months of the lease, for instance. So we want to make sure that we really limit that, because, say for instance that the landlord wants to come in and put up a for rent sign on your space. That might not look good if you're still operating, especially to your employees. That might raise some concerns. So making sure that we keep those things under control. Yeah, and then property and building rules, that I can only say here, they vary very wildly. So review those carefully, make sure that you do understand your property, your building rules, so that you don't get caught off guard by, getting a letter from your landlord saying that you're in default because you haven't been following some obscure building rule. Hours of operation, this is, going to be probably something that jumps out to you pretty quickly, but consider your business needs. What does holidays look like before you sign that lease? You want to make sure that your business is prepared to maintain those hours of operation. And then we also want to make sure, I'm going to touch on this in a little bit, that we've got some type of language around what happens in the event that there's something outside of your control that makes you not able to operate in those hours, which we've seen here in COVID-19, having government orders that we can't operate. Okay, risk allocation. So these are terms, I'd highly recommend having an attorney assist you with these terms, because, they're really going to be where the dollars and cents comes down. And what am noticing is left off this list is indemnification, but a lot of times all of these clauses, what you're going to see is that they're one-sided. The landlord's going to give you the lease, and it's going to be entirely one-sided in favor of the landlord. So we're going to want to make sure that we really work hard to negotiate in as much as we can in terms of these risk allocation clauses. The first one being default. What is a default? So that's really going to be the big question. What constitutes a default under this lease? You're going to see a laundry list of different default triggers. The main one is going to be failure to pay rent, any rent amount that's due under the lease, whether that's base rent, additional rent, or any other amounts that are owed to the landlord. You really should have a grace period before failure to pay rent is considered a default. It shouldn't be a default if you've not paid your rent by the 2nd of the month. I would recommend trying to work in at least a 10-day grace period before you're considered to be in default. Other defaults, so that's for failure to pay rent. Other defaults might have different cure periods, for instance. So, abandonment of the property, any other default, the failure to, repair or maintain the space, you should be able to have a notice period with 30 days to cure before you're considered to be in default. Abandonment is one that you will see in there. We want to make sure that we understand, what does it mean to abandon the space? Does that mean that you have gone on vacation and you've closed your doors, for a little while you're out on vacation? Or is it, typically you're going to see 30 days that you're not in the space. I would recommend including that you, as long as you're paying rent, you haven't abandoned the space. So, if abandonment is that you have moved out and you're not paying rent, then you've defaulted for abandonment. And then bankruptcy and insolvency is another one that you're going to see pretty frequently. Landlord default is not typically addressed in these leases. Again, the landlord's attorney drafted this lease, so they're not going to address landlord default, which means that any option that you had to terminate the lease is now almost entirely gone, because the landlord can't default because it's not in the lease. So we want to make sure that we do include some type of landlord default. I have gotten a lot of pushback on this with certain landlords, and it's a big red flag, really, because landlords shouldn't be so arrogant to think that they can't default under the lease. They do also have maintenance and repair obligations typically, as well as other non-monetary obligations. So we do want to make sure that it's addressed. Typically, it's going to be 30 days with a cure period, so that you notify the landlord, and if they don't cure within 30 days, then they're in default. So we do want to make sure we include that in there. And then what remedies does each party have in the event that the other party defaults? So typically you're going to have the ability to terminate. You might also have, as a tenant, you could negotiate in the ability to remedy the default and offset the rent. So let's say, for instance, that the landlord has failed to replace a window that was broken. Then you can replace that window yourself, and then you can offset the rent that amount. That's going to be difficult to negotiate in, but possible. And then specific performance and damages, so you can, direct them to perform, whatever the default is, that essentially you can file suit against them to collect damages or get specific performance ordered against them. Hazardous waste and ADA compliance. So hazardous waste is strict joint and several liability. So the landlord should be representing and warranting that there's no pre-existing condition on the space. You should be able to obtain the most recent environmental report, and the landlord should indemnify you in the event that there is hazardous waste on the premises. Do consider also, if your business is of the type that you're going to be using hazardous materials, make sure that you have made that clear in the lease, what the rules are around that. ADA compliance, the landlord should be responsible for maintaining ADA compliance throughout the building and in the common areas, and they should be able to represent and warrant to that. And the tenant is responsible for tenant work, and the landlord should indemnify the tenant for any violations that don't relate to their tenant work. I'm going to breeze past these because we're running out of time, and I do want to get to COVID-19 considerations here. So destruction and condemnation, insurance, make sure you have your broker review. Destruction and condemnation is something you're going to want to have an attorney take a look at. Those clauses can be often glanced over, but let's say, for instance, the light rail, the government exercises eminent domain over your building, or even restricts access to your building because they're building the light rail. We want to make sure that we know how that's going to impact our space and our lease. And then force majeure. Force majeure is something that never got too much attention in leases until COVID-19. Pandemics, everyone was looking in their first force majeure clauses to see if pandemics were listed in there or acts of government. So I would recommend making sure that those are, one, mutual, because the landlord will not give your lease to you with mutual force majeure in all likelihood. So make sure that it's mutual. It's typically not going to apply to financial provisions. So, you're still going to have to pay your rent, but it could help you in the event that you're not able to meet a non-monetary obligation. So, repairs, let's say, for instance, that construction's not working, so you're not able to get a drywall guy in there to fix the wall, then force majeure can help you out there. So I want to make sure that we have listed pandemics, acts of government. Typically, you will also see some sort of a catch-all of anything that's not in the party's reasonable control. Okay, COVID-19 considerations. So I'm going to we've got a blog post up on our page that I've got a link to here at the end of this presentation, but I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a spoiler here. There are 5 questions that you're going to want to ask yourself before you go back to your landlord to renegotiate your lease or to try and terminate your lease. The first one is, what does your lease say? You want to make sure that you understand what your lease says before you go to your landlord. You want to make sure that you know what the termination provisions say, what options you have around assignment and sublet. What are you in default currently, and if so, what are your landlord's rights? What do you want? So of course, everyone's going to want something different. So maybe you want to terminate entirely, or maybe you want a rent reduction or a rent deferral. There's lots of different things that we can consider there. What does your landlord want? That's going to be your point of leverage. If your landlord wants to keep you, you're going to have some room to negotiate. What are you willing to give? So we can't expect to get something without giving something in return. So, if we want to terminate, then we might need to buy our way out of the lease if we have any cash to do so. What is your backup plan? So, go in with, with at least, with your preferred option, and then have a backup plan for what happens if the landlord doesn't want to negotiate with me on that. Can I go back with this different idea? So some of the considerations here are power dynamics. If your landlord, is a large entity, then you might have less leverage. But if they're sort of a small family run, then you might have some sort of a beneficial power dynamic there and some leverage. Also, just the relationship dynamic. If your landlord, the success stories that we're seeing are folks who have approached their landlords with that really, sort of positive relationship dynamic, and said, hey, let's get through this together, because I know you don't want to have to look for a new tenant, and so I don't want to have to move out, but I can't pay my rent right now because I don't have any revenue. So how can we both get through this thing together? Renewal. So if your lease is coming up for renewal or it's set to expire pretty soon, that's going to be a point of leverage for you as well, because your landlord wants to keep you and doesn't want to spend a bunch of money to go and find a new tenant, and doesn't want the space to sit vacant for a while. And in this economy, it's likely that that's what'll happen. Technical considerations: make sure if you do have any phone line or internet or servers or anything like that that you need to make sure that are set up before you leave, make sure that you've considered that before you terminate your lease and have to leave. And then, do you have the ability to assign or sublet to a new tenant, and what does that look like? Some things that you can ask for. I see we're at time here, so again, this presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel after this, and we'll email it to the participants. But what can you ask for? Some of the things that we've seen tenants ask for is rent abatement, reduction, or deferral. That's probably the most common one, that we just can't pay our rent right now, so can we get a rent abatement? Again, if you were going to have to find a new tenant, you'd have to likely offer them rent abatement as well. So can I get the benefit of that? You might want to reduce your footprint if, for instance, you're looking at having fewer employees working in the office and more working remotely. You might not want to have such a big space. Tenant improvements. Maybe your office is going to look different because you're going to be using more flex space, for instance, and less less sort of regular workstations. Co-tenancy, again, you might see, oh, well, if that Macy's goes out of business, or if that Nordstrom goes out of business, then, I'm going to be up a creek because I'm not going to be able to have, any of the benefit of that foot traffic. So that's something that we're seeing a lot of as well. Early termination. So, possibly all we can do is say we really want out. Possibly your landlord is going to require you to buy your way out of your lease if you have any cash at all to do that. But like I said, it's going to be tough to accomplish that early termination because most commercial leases just don't provide for it. So all kinds of things to consider here. I guess one thing that I also didn't put on here as far as considerations is eviction moratoriums. So while your landlord may want to evict you, for defaulting, there might be state or local moratoriums on doing so. So that can also be a point of leverage. Okay, so resources. Here's a few of our blog posts that we have up on our website. If you just go to our blog and search lease, you'll be able to pull these up. These kind of touch on a lot of the same areas that I talked about today, but probably in a little bit more detail. And I did answer a couple of questions throughout this presentation. If you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. My email is ashley@equinoxbusinesslaw.com, or you can reach out to contact@equinoxbusinesslaw.com, or you can go onto our website. So we've got our contact information there. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.